All right. Again, welcome to the Watershed Institute's Technical Friday. I appreciate everyone's attendance. If you don't know us, our mission is to keep water clean, safe, and healthy, and we work to protect and restore our water and natural environment in central New Jersey through conservation, advocacy, science, and education. Um, for today's webinar logistics, we are recording it. Yes, we will send you a link to the recording. They are on our YouTube channel, so you can find those later. We will provide a copy of all the slides. If you have questions, please use the question and answer feature. We will take questions. We usually hold the questions until the end of the presentation, but if there's something that I see that I think we really need to sort of interrupt the Professor Payne's discussion and answer that question, I will do that. But for the most part, those will be at the end. I greatly appreciate everyone attending and giving up part of their Friday to do this webinar. Professor Payne is a member of Rutgers University faculty where she teaches international environmental law. She's also the chair of the Ocean Law Specialist Group of the International Union for Conservation of Nature World Commission on Environmental Law. As I mentioned, Professor has a presentation right after this webinar, so we're going to jump right into it. And again, Professor Payne, thank you very much for giving us your time and expertise on this topic. This is not one we've normally done, so I'm sort of excited on this. So thank you, and I will turn it over to you.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted and appreciative to be here. It's an opportunity for me to be thinking about how to tie the international work that I get to do to the place that I live and teach, New Jersey. So I want to start with a cool natural history story. And so I want to take us from New Jersey to the open ocean, way out there, and tell you a tale of a mussel and an eel. Then I'd like to share the effects of the triple planetary crisis on the eel and other marine life, and introduce, finally, this new international agreement that seeks to address those problems. So here's the story. We start up the Delaware River. And mussels, many of you may know, are filter feeders that are very effective at providing us with clean water. In fact, there's this quote that the Delaware River has an estimated 280 million eastern elliptios mussels that filter the entire flow of the river 6 times before it reaches Delaware Bay. So what's that got to do with an international treaty? Well, as larvae, this mussel lives for 2 to 4 weeks attached to the gills of the American eel, as in this photo. The picture on the left is a picture of the gills of an American eel, and little dots are larval mussels. And this is an essential part of the mussel's life cycle to be with this eel. So you can see that without the American eel, we don't have the mussels, and that's an important connection to water quality in the Delaware River. So the eel, this is the eel at maturity. This eel that is critical to the mussel's life cycle has an interesting lifestyle of its own. So it's a little elaborate diagram, but what this is showing is that it matures in our freshwater rivers for as long as maybe 30 years. And then the eels migrate 1,000 miles to the Sargasso Sea. And in the picture, you can see we've got the coast of the United States and kind of off the Carolinas and Florida, there's a blob. That's roughly where the Sargasso Sea is, near Bermuda. So the eels go there, they spawn, and they die. This is the opposite of what salmon do, right? Salmon live out in the ocean, mature, and then they go up rivers to spawn. Eels do the reverse. So the juvenile eels mature there, the eggs hatch. Juvenile eels mature in their nursery, the Sargasso Sea. And they turn into glass eels, these little guys, who migrate back to New Jersey and repeat the cycle, mature in our rivers and estuaries. And we rely on the clean water. The mussels rely on the eels. The eels rely on us to protect their nursery grounds, the Sargasso Sea. It's the only sea in the world that is defined by currents. So this is, again, a very schematic map to give you an idea of where it is. In this case, there are 4 Atlantic Ocean currents that together make up the clockwise circulating North Atlantic gyre. And that encloses a unique area that's about 1,100 kilometers wide and 3,200 kilometers long. It consists of a mat of sargassum weed, and that's that kind of golden yellow that you see in the image on the left. It's one of the biodiverse ecosystems in the oceans, hundreds of miles from our coasts. So if you've taken an airplane across the Pacific or Atlantic Ocean and you've looked out and you've just seen that kind of flat battleship gray surface with nothing on it, that is not at all representative. There are rich ecosystems, both at the microscopic level, I'll show you in a minute, even near the surface, but once you get down below the water, that's 97% of the habitable space for life on our planet. So it is extraordinarily biodiverse. The Sargasso Sea in particular is a nice example. It's a crucial spawning ground for eels, but also for marlin. It's a nursery for juvenile sea turtles. We never knew where the sea turtles went to when they were adolescents, after they hatched on the beaches. And this is one of the places they go. It's also feeding and hunting grounds for birds and pelagic fish. The water, as you can see in the picture, is deep blue and exceptionally clear. And it's known for these floating clumps or mats of sargassum seaweed. It's been called the golden rainforest of the high seas. And I want to emphasize that this is just one of these amazing ecosystems, with many that are quite different from this, but also complex and rich. So the open ocean is connected vertically so you can imagine that in the atmosphere, in the airspace, there's birds. When you get down to the surface of the air and the water, you have critters like these. You may have seen Portuguese man-o-war washed up on the beach, or hopefully not while you were swimming. That's the one in the upper right. There's also just below it a young flying fish. But some of these other creatures in the pictures that live right at that surface of the ocean may be less familiar to you. And of course, they're at different scales. Some are bigger than others. But this biodiversity continues right down through the water column and to the seabed sediments where there's life as well. The open ocean is also connected to coasts. And the American eel is, of course, a great example of how the middle of the Atlantic Ocean is connected through the American eel to our freshwater rivers and performs an important ecological function in both. The fisheries, of course, are another way that we perceive the connection between our coasts and the ocean. Now, these are some examples of highly migratory species. Some of our coastal fish, they're just kind of hanging out there near shore. They don't go way out into the ocean. But the great white shark and the Pacific bluefin tuna roam across the seas, as do, well, all tuna do. The leatherback turtle visits 32 countries in its roaming around, and a lot of birds, for example, the Laysan albatross spends 75% of the year in the high seas. That means that many different countries need to cooperate in conservation. And that's why I'm sitting here at the United Nations. And I apologize also for the background noise. But Um, we need to get together with other countries if we're going to protect these areas. We're still discovering new life forms. There's more to discover. We're still mapping the ocean floor. It's still true that the moon is better mapped, and individual humans have spent more time on the surface of the moon than have spent on the deep sea bed. Now, these critters aren't alone in the ocean. And this is a conglomerate slide that my partner has pointed out is way messy. But I just wanted to give you, without dwelling too much on it, a picture of some of the things that are affecting life in the ocean. In the middle, fishing, in particular, illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing is a huge problem. And currently, it's the biggest threat to ocean life. Shipping. The picture at the top is a map. You can actually get this real-time map that shows where ships are all over the world. This gives you sort of an impression of the density of ship patterns in many parts of the world. And um, that can have serious impacts on particular species. We've got some potential for geoengineering technologies. That's on the side to the right. Ocean fertilization, alkalinization, foams, artificial upwelling, cloud seeding, solar radiation management. These are all things that could have impacts on ocean life. We're just doing an early testing now of those technologies, but at scale, they could have serious impacts. Even submarine cables, most of our cellular connections that are to other countries are handled actually by submarine cables. That's the image in the lower right, which looks like an old-fashioned map, but it's actually showing you where the major cables between Europe and the United States are. That's how our signals are carried. And of course, plastic is a huge problem. Moreover, climate change is a triple threat. The oceans are much warmer than they used to be. That results in less oxygen, which is dire for many species of life. And it's more acidic because the ocean absorbs about 30% of our excess carbon. So it's performing this huge service, but at great detriment to the health of the ocean. So actually, you might have noticed the effect of warming of the ocean. If you buy fish caught by the New Jersey fishing fleet, for instance, out of Barnegat Bay, they're getting some species that used to come from, say, the Carolinas, places further south. That's because it's getting too warm in those lower latitudes, and the fish are actually visibly moving north. So this widespread agreement that the ocean should be protected and managed in some way. The governance regime is very fragmented. There are hundreds of global and regional treaties that manage these activities, but they have gaps and limitations. For example, they all have some kind of regional coverage, but if you put them all together, it looks sort of like a moth-eaten quilt. There's big holes in that coverage. In some cases, for instance, the regional fisheries management organizations, which are one of the main sources of governance in the ocean, in areas beyond national jurisdiction, are focused on target species. So they do scientific studies and they allocate catch for particular species, but they don't necessarily take account of non-target species or non-fish species. So this is what brings us to this room at the United Nations, where delegates from most of the 193 United Nations member states have been negotiating this new treaty. We started the negotiation formally in 2018, although the idea of needing it sort of started really in 2002 or maybe earlier even. But last year, after some interruptions by COVID, when it was impossible to meet, the treaty was adopted by delegates at the UN. Next year will be the 1 year anniversary. Sorry, next week will be the 1 year anniversary of the adoption of the treaty text by delegates at the UN. So these diplomats and often delegates coming from the capital, not just the diplomats who are always in New York, but some of the specialists in ocean affairs, came from Canada, Russia, China, the US, small island developing states like Micronesia, South Africa, Algeria, Colombia, the European Union. Costa Rica was a very important voice in the negotiation. Even landlocked Switzerland, Botswana, Nepal were there working on this, along with members of international organizations like the UN Environment Program, my own organization, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the International Maritime Organization, and others, and civil society, particularly the High Seas Alliance, which is an umbrella group that coordinated many of the NGOs from all over the world, including some from Latin America, Africa, Pacific Island region, Asia. So groups like AIDA, Greenpeace, many, many others. Spent a lot of time in this room, let's just say. So the treaty has a very long name, but it's explanatory. So I'll go through it slowly, but on one breath. It is a legally binding implementing agreement to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And for short, we call it the BB&J agreement. Now, we get a certain amount of grief about this. So I made a special slide, except that I'm having trouble switching the slide because my computer's confused about what I'm doing. Let's try that. There we go. People often say PB&J. No, not PB&J. It's BB&J, biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. No confusion on that. So through the law, I need to explain a little bit of international law here, in particular law of the sea. So through the Law of the Sea Convention, the nations of the world agreed back in 1982 to extend their sovereign rights to the seas 200 miles from their shores, and even beyond that in some particular cases. Now, this is called the exclusive economic zone. And I have a nice map here that shows you what this looks like. So all the dark blue here is the ocean that's under the jurisdiction of the coastal states. Because of this, the United States has jurisdiction over more ocean domain than land. Isn't that amazing? The light blue area, and I guess I should say the reason for the 200-mile limit, it was negotiated with states having different interests in that, but ultimately that is the region where the natural resources that people covet are located, fish and minerals. That's where they're the most accessible. The light blue area is the remaining shared ocean, which is a global commons. No nation can claim sovereignty there. It's also called the high seas. And so this light blue area is that area beyond national jurisdiction that the new BB&J agreement will apply to. In legal terms, and it's also that light blue area is also referred to as the high seas. The high seas are common areas where all states have rights to fish, to traverse with ships, to lay submarine cables, to lay pipelines. There's another way of thinking about this, which is the legal concept of common concern, which is the basis for protecting biodiversity under international law. And the Law of the Sea Convention took one other step of great importance. It declared the resources of the seabed and its subsoil to be the common heritage of mankind, or as we now say, humankind, establishing an administrative framework for deep seabed mining. In economic terms, the ocean is an open access commons where governance and sustainable use will be very hard to implement. And yet, that's what we're trying to do. So the new treaty provides benefits sought by both developed and developing countries. How will it provide for conservation and sustainable use? So this is the text from the adoption, sort of setting the mandate for the negotiation. And you can see that it refers to 4 elements: marine genetic resources, including questions on the sharing of benefits, measures such as area-based management tools, including marine protected areas, environmental impact assessments, and capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. Okay, and I'll explain a little bit about these. So there are 2 conservation elements: the environmental impact assessment and the marine protected areas. For environmental impact assessment, you may be familiar with what we do in New Jersey or what we do in the United States under the National Environmental Policy Act. When an activity under those provisions, under those laws, when an activity is going to reach a threshold of some significant impact on the environment, or it's anticipated to, then the proponent of the activity has to do an assessment. They have to describe the scope of the activity and what it might affect. And then the idea is that they should compare that to what happens if they don't do the activity. And they should also come up with some alternatives. Because if they find impacts, the goal of this whole process is to identify ways that the impacts can be removed or reduced by revising the proposed project. Okay, so this is similar to that. It's a very similar process. And that will assist in, I'm just taking a look at my notes actually, because I started talking off my notes. So some of the things that are a little different here is that the treaty restricts the scope of the environmental impact assessment primarily to activities that take place within this areas beyond national jurisdiction, within the high seas. So if the US, if NOAA decided to do something within the 200 miles of the US exclusive economic zone, then it would have only limited obligations to prepare an environmental impact assessment, even if those activities might affect the shared ocean. But there are some rules for activities that would take place within national jurisdiction that would affect the shared ocean. They're just more limited. And it's fairly technical, so I'm not going to try to explain those now. I think 2 points are quite important here. One is that the treaty does set out a process. It's very similar to the US process of the steps that need to be taken, the kinds of public consultations and analysis and monitoring that needs to be done in an environmental assessment. And as part of that, it includes a cumulative impacts analysis. And this is something that we do. It's become more common. It's relatively complex, though. So, for example, there's a proposed activity. Let's say there's another activity that also affects the same environment. You should consider the impacts of both of those things. Or say there are 3 projects that are similar that are going to be in generally the same region or that might affect the same region or same ecosystems. You need to look at all 3 projects together not just one by one, because one project may not have much of an effect, but all three together might be quite damaging. Climate change is also an important factor, and the treaty includes that cumulative effects analysis should include projections of warming that are anticipated, of acidification and deoxygenation, which consider climate-related relocation of species, shifting ocean currents, freshening of seawater and sea ice melts, and other factors. Now, those aren't all mentioned in detail in the treaty text, just to be clear about that, but that's what that's referring to. So then all of this information will be shared with the rest of the world through an online clearinghouse, or be sort of an internet-based site that governments, scientists, civil society will be able to go to see what's being proposed, and will be able to provide additional information and their views on the project. And that may lead to revising the project in ways that are more beneficial. The second approach is to increase ecological resilience to withstand impacts from greenhouse gas pollution and other harms that can't be reduced directly. Establishing high seas marine protected areas is an element of the BB&J agreement that should provide a kind of climate change adaptation by creating marine protected areas where human activities will be restricted. And there is also the possibility of other area-based management tools, that is, governing approaches that might say, that might have more limited scope than a marine protected area. For example, rerouting shipping around an area where it's known that marine mammals are giving birth. So how would that work? How do these things actually help in relation to climate change? Well, consider an analogy to your health. If you haven't had enough sleep and you haven't been eating a healthy diet, you may be more susceptible to catching a cold if you're exposed to a virus. And now to compare it to the ocean, remember I said that we're seeing fish populations are already shifting to other parts of the ocean as the water temperature heats up due to climate change. That means that animals that prey on them may have to travel further to find food, making them more vulnerable. And there isn't anything that we can do in the near term to control the seawater temperature. But if we reduce the fishing effort by humans on those species that are stressed by climate change-induced migration, and we divert ships around the region where they live so that they suffer less mortality from ship strikes, they may be more resilient and able to fight the impacts of climate change, greenhouse gas emissions on their environment. So for our part-time New Jersey resident, the American eel, the agreement allows the countries that join the treaty to designate parts of the ocean, like the Sargasso Sea, as protected areas. And that could mean that ship traffic would be routed around it and fishing might be prohibited. A third approach is to provide resources to build capacity for developing states, both to participate in the treaty's activities and also to participate in associated scientific research and other activities, and to support technology of transfer of marine technologies. Fourth element. The fourth element is related to sharing marine genetic resources that are found in this global common space. So countries with advanced technology currently are collecting specimens like these deep ocean mussels and crabs. They then do genetic research and profit from valuable products such as pharmaceuticals and even laundry detergent. This part of the agreement allocates some of the benefits of genetic prospecting that comes from living things as the source material, these living things that are located in the global commons, outside of sovereign territory. The agreement was proposed in 2002, as I mentioned, and further negotiations went forward until 2015. The negotiations then took another, 2016 or 2018, depending on where you start counting, to last year. The text was adopted last June. It was signed, open for signature at the United Nations in September, and we have 90 states signed so far. 7 states have ratified, and the goal is ratification by 60 states by 2025. At that point, the treaty will come into force for those states that have ratified it. So the process, if you're not familiar with it, is that this is sort of the treaty is proposed, it's negotiated. The governments decide that they're ready to agree to the text, and they adopt the text. It's then got to be signed by governments, and then they go through, and this is where we are now, a national process of reviewing what laws might be needed in the national legal system to actually implement obligations in the treaty. And then there is usually a process for ratification. In the United States, that's set out in the US Constitution, and it entails 2/3 of the senators present at the time of the vote voting to recommend ratification to the president. The president then ratifies the treaty and sends the instrument of ratification to the United Nations or the depository, whatever that is. And then the United States can become party to the treaty at that point. So that's the place we are now. Of course, we would love to see the United States become a party to this treaty. The United States was very active in the negotiation, generally very constructively. And the United States did sign the treaty in September, which means that we are bound to support the object and purpose of the treaty. We're not legally bound to the specific terms, but we have a sort of quasi-legal commitment to support the treaty. So what's left? What's left to do? For governments to continue with their efforts to sign, ratify, and implement the agreement, which is, I have to say, also known as the High Seas Biodiversity Treaty. Not our favorite name, but you'll see that in the press. For scientists to collaborate on scientific networks to support precautionary decision-making within the treaty. For civil society to educate the public on the value of ocean ecosystems. So I hope you'll share this with people you know and seek out more information. And if you actually are an expert in this area, use your voice. And for industry, first, to do no harm, to apply precaution, transparency, and long-term stewardship principles to your activities. Can we do it? During the course of the negotiation, states acted out of their national interest. For example, strongly supporting the negotiation process, but still trying to protect their domestic fishing industry by opposing inclusion of fisheries management in the agreement. It is included. States have also acted altruistically, proposing strong environmental impact measures, for example. Some states have said, oh, it's far away, it's out of sight, it's out of mind, we have more urgent problems, or even we should take the minerals and fish before others do. They've also taken the position, however, that they can cooperate in the interests of young people alive today and future generations, that we can plan across different industrial sectors, including fishing, mining, and shipping, and deep ocean energy, a new field, to consider cumulative effects on sensitive ecosystems. And states have found that they can take a precautionary approach by restraining exploitation and pollution until we know what there is there, and we can develop technologies that will allow the most valuable uses while respecting the life forms. The eventual ability to implement this agreement with enough parties to make it functional will depend on whether states see cooperation on these issues as sufficiently beneficial to their national interests. It's clear that the US and other states, including Russia, are moving away from multilateralism and toward bilateralism or even isolationism. We need public understanding of the value of the open ocean and its life, and we need support for this treaty, which has strong rules and precautionary principles. In 1991, writing about the very different, much more focused problem of regulating chemicals that cause the ozone hole in the atmosphere, Professor David Caron said, "In negotiations concerning environmental matters, there is the added and quite different task of the parties seeking to discover precisely what the environment requires. In this sense, the environment is an unobtrusive but central presence in the negotiations. It is also a party that refuses to negotiate." Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you very much. So yes, if anyone has questions, please put that in the Q&A box on Zoom. I have so many questions. So let me start. And I say this in almost every webinar. I schedule these because it's a topic that interests me and I want to learn more. Um, so you went through sort of the process of the UN adopting this, and then the states, or i.e., the countries, um, um, adopting and ratifying it.
Right.
So since we've signed on, but we haven't ratified the treaty, what are the ramifications if we don't ratify the treaty for the US?
Well, it means to our detriment that we have less voice. So there will become a point once the treaty's in force that countries that haven't ratified, even if they've signed, will only be able to be observers at the meetings. And when the first meeting, which might take place as soon as 2025, maybe 2026, um, will establish a lot of the rules and structures, guidelines, things that will really direct how the treaty is implemented going forward. So it's important to have that seat at the table, which we get if we ratify the treaty. The US always has, and we play this role in other treaties where we haven't become parties, like the Convention on Biological Diversity or the Seabed Mining Agreement. But we do have a strong voice simply because we're such a powerful country. We're an important maritime country. We're a huge economy. I mean, we know the reasons we're able to get attention, but there's still a lot that we can't do. It also means that we aren't specifically bound, and for things like the environmental impact assessments, we can certainly, and without that much trouble, adopt some adjustments to our normal environmental impact assessment practice that would, and go ahead and implement it. There's no reason not to, and we could. For other things like dealing with the marine protected areas or marine genetic resources, it complicates things for us, and it could create impediments for our industry. For instance, if they're acting outside the system, then other marketing partners might not want to accept their products.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, you started, so with our NEPA process, we could include that analysis whether we ratify the treaty or not. So if, and I'm just using this as an example, I think there's a proposal to do a seawall floodgates along the Hudson. If that is a source of American eels, and that we would have to look at impacts on the eels from that flood wall. and the impacts on the Sargasso Sea um, spawning bed. That would be something we would already sort of have to do.
Yeah,
So
that's a
yeah.
nice example. And in fact, one of the reasons in that article about the mussels and the eel in the Delaware River, the article was actually advocating for keeping the Delaware River free of dams and obstructions.
Mhm.
So yes, excellent point. But that's right.
I was going to say putting a seawall or a floodgate on the Delaware, but I know there is an actual proposal along
Yeah.
that. Um, there is a question in the chat. What does Rutgers University Marine Field Station specifically do as part of the BBNJ, if anything?
Well, it's a good question, and I don't have an answer to it, but we're I think this is really where the ball is perhaps in my court to push more now that we have treaty text to help colleagues, other colleagues at Rutgers understand how it affects what they're doing and to make those links. And your help will be gratefully appreciated if you have suggestions. So
All right.
I can put my email address in the chat.
Sounds good. Yeah, and we will share that, and we will also share a link to the treaty for people to peruse. Um, while waiting for another question. So you mentioned, and I know we're having this issue on land, but fish that is, I think you used the example from the Carolinas are now found in New Jersey.
Yeah.
I'm assuming the fish that used to be found in New Jersey are starting to migrate north as well. What happens when they can't go any farther north?
Mm, yeah. That's a good question. So actually, Malin Pinsky, who was until recently on the faculty at Rutgers, has done a lot of work on looking at these temperature-related migrations of fish species. And so he's documented for particular species some of what's going on. And I think also a lot of the work that goes on out of Sandy Hook, where they're tracking that kind of thing. Um, we also have that scientific information um, about how these migrations are moving. It's a real problem. For terrestrial species, the discussion is, can we relocate them? There's a little rodent called a pika. It's this kind of cute little chipmunky thing that lives up in the mountains in the Sierras out west, and they live at high altitudes. So for species that live at low altitudes, they can go to a higher altitude to find cooler environments. The pika, there's nowhere to go. There's another species called a desmon. It's kind of like a platypus that lives in the Pyrenees. And I was with a group of Danish researchers a number of years ago who were talking about, could we move it to Denmark where it would be cool enough for it? Because there's, a small population surviving and they're going to be gone. You can't really do that with fish. So good question.
Yeah,
Maybe we lose them. Mhm.
and I think you said this, but New Jersey has a very, very strong fishing fleet. And if the fish
Yeah.
they are seeking aren't around or much, much farther out to sea or up north, then they either have to switch fish or go out of business. And so our part of our economy, both in New Jersey and elsewhere, relies on
Mhm.
this fishing and having a healthy population to harvest.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I've wondered too how much they have to switch up their gear, which isn't a trivial matter if they're having different species.
hmm, all right. Um, There is a question here, which actually is more related to us, I think.
Hmm.
Education with our academia is something that will drive awareness. Is the watershed planning for these awareness sessions, especially in schools? So I will say we have an education department here that works with elementary, middle, and high school. Um, we're actually running a program of stream watch schools to get children as young as I think kindergarten, first grade, understanding and engaging in science and water quality. This thing has not yet risen to our radar on school education, but our Technical Friday series, our Watershed Wednesday series are things that we do to help educate the public, to help educate our elected officials and others. So we will certainly continue to do these things and, engage as we can on these kinds of legal issues because, as you started off, Professor, water quality in the Delaware is ultimately important for the health of our oceans and those that rely on it.
Yep.
Um, can do you know where we are in the US in ratifying this treaty? Because I can only imagine, not getting into politics, but getting two-thirds of the Senate to ratify anything at this point. Um, is there any plans, any discussions? Is that going on in Congress right now, or is that to be
So,
determined?
my understanding is that the State Department is taking the steps. They have a lot of work they need to do to prepare a transmittal to the Senate explaining the impacts and so on. And that my understanding is that they are doing that. I will say was you're of course quite right that it the we've had some difficulty in getting treaties ratified. Um, but there is a nice counterexample. So the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. So the Montreal Protocol regulates ozone depleting substances. Folks may remember the hole over Antarctica and all that. Sheep in New Zealand having to wear sunglasses if we didn't fix it, that kind of thing. And so we have a very effective treaty system that's been extremely successful at limiting the chemicals that damage the ozone layer that protects us from certain kinds of solar radiation. And it turns out that one of the substitute chemicals that is used because it doesn't hurt the ozone layer is very, very bad climate forcing chemical. So it's bad for climate change, good for ozone, bad for climate change. And so there was a new amendment to that treaty, to the Montreal Protocol, to prohibit the use of that chemical. And this is called the Kigali Amendment. And so the point is that this Senate ratified that treaty to ban that particular chemical. So I think there it probably was because industry was supportive of this. Um, and it's kind of not a high profile issue,
Mhm.
but gives me hope.
Is the U.S. fishing industry on board with this treaty, or are they been opposing it? Is there a chance we can get it through the
Um,
Senate because they are supporting it and because then it would be in their long term benefits? But
um, for certain parts of the industry, yes, not necessarily all parts of the
okay.
industry.
All right. As you know, that is the problem. Uh,
Yeah. I wonder, I was just putting something into the chat with your permission,
mhm.
which is, so there's in the law of the sea world, another thing that's been going on is that so the Law of the Sea Convention, which the US has signed but not ratified. Um, so we don't get to participate in this tribunal, but it has an international court called the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. And that tribunal was recently asked by a group of small island developing states, what our country, to give an advisory opinion on what countries' obligations are to deal with climate change and ocean acidification under the Law of the Sea Convention. The opinion came out in May, and in fact, there's been a lot of discussion here at the UN about that. And in about 15 to 25 minutes, there's going to be a panel on it that will be broadcast on UN TV. So if anyone's eager for yet more webinars, you can watch it. And that's the link. But
Nice.
the registrar from the tribunal and the one of the lead litigators for the small island states will be speaking on the panel, as will I.
Very nice. All right. Last question, because I know you have to actually go and do that. Um, do you have a take on aquaculture versus fishing in the wild and its impacts on biodiversity?
A good question. I think it's a very broad question. And the speaking as so as lawyers, one of the fun things about being a lawyer is, since there's a lot of lawyers in this call, you probably know this already, is that we get to be kind of bone up on all kinds of things. So speaking not as someone who's an expert on either thing, but who pays attention, I think it's very site specific. It could be aquaculture is tied up in this question of nature-based solutions. You know, is it going to be harmful to things like mangroves and seagrasses that we are hoping will sequester carbon? Um, you know, there's a lot of issues around that. Um, the in terms of the feedstocks, there is a huge issue. So if we think of farmed salmon, they need to be fed something. One of the things that some countries like Norway are considering feeding them is the fish mass, the biomass from what's called the twilight zone or the mesopelagic zone of the ocean. This
Hmm.
is so the surface is where we do most of our fishing, and then that's where there's sunlight. Where at the next layer is just where there's almost no sunlight, and so that's why it's called the twilight zone, not because it's spooky. And technically, it's called the mesopelagic. So that's an area where those the biodiversity there hasn't been well studied, but what we're realizing is that it's huge biomass. It's also extremely important for the carbon cycle to sequester carbon. It is described as the largest migration on Earth. Every night, critters from that zone rise to the surface and then sink down again. And that's part of the carbon sequestration process. They're
Hmm.
also the food source for everything from the great whales to uh, a lot of our target fish species. You know, it's an incredibly important area, but some countries see it as a potential fishery where it would be possible to get food to feed to salmon that are being cultivated in aquaculture.
Okay. A lot of interrelated issues on that.
Yeah, yeah. And the BB&J agreement could address that
Hmm.
potentially through the marine protected areas and other tools like that. So that's and the environmental impact assessment measures.
All right. All right. Well, great. Hey, I appreciate your time. I'm going to give it back to you so you can get your thoughts collected for your next session there. Professor, again, thank you very much for attending and giving us that fascinating. Like I said, I do these things half because I want to learn more, and that was extremely uh, enlightening. And so again, sort of everything we do is sort of interrelated. We talk about one water on land, it's one water on this planet. So
Mhm.
great. And then everyone who has attended, I appreciate it. We have a few technical Fridays coming up. If you were at our water supply one last month, beginning of this month or last month, we talked about one on the state plan at the end of this month. That is being rescheduled because the state hasn't actually released the state plan. So we can't talk about what hasn't been released yet because we don't know what's in it. So that is going to be rescheduled. We are going to do a webinar for lawyers and elected officials on stormwater and the residential site improvement standards and why it seems kind of, at least in my humble opinion, silly to restrict municipalities for doing what they can to protect their residents, which is what RSIS does. And then we are working on finalizing a schedule for daylighting streams later in the fall, so October or November. So those are a couple of our webinars that we have in the works. Please check back. Again, Professor, thank you very much. Have a great day, everyone, and have a great weekend.